Through all of time, we've seen presidents and leaders across the world who have had leadership moments and very powerful symbols that were important for a nation to see at any given time to show a message of resilience and determination. Like Churchill, we saw him inspecting the bombing damage. It sent a powerful message of leadership to the British people.
White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany with that comparison earlier this month defending President Trump's photo op outside St. John's Episcopal Church. Joining us now, best-selling author Erik Larson. His recent book is entitled The Splendid and the Vile, a saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Erik, thanks so much for coming back. I don't really want to talk about this president, but I do want people who may be supporting this president to consider who they vote for when looking for their next president, as well as other Americans, because Winston Churchill did something, and you can see it so clearly in your book, time and time again. When he had bad news to deliver to the British people, he did it. He never sugarcoated. Just how bad things could be. And I go to page 57, where it is one of those remarkable moments you describe when many people in the Conservative Party wanted to strike a peace deal with Churchill. Churchill went and talked to members of Parliament and said, "I am convinced that every man of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." A far cry from a president who won't wear a mask.
Very much so.
Well, talk about Churchill, if you will, though, and how Churchill, you explained, Churchill always gave the bad news, but then always lifted his supporters up and the British people up, believing they could get through those tough times. It was a formula that he did time and time again throughout the book, which you can read, or throughout the war, and certainly you can read throughout the book.
Yeah, well, you know, with regard to Churchill, now, actually, there's an awful lot that you can say that's bad about Churchill, but not for this particular period. He really was the man for the hour. And the thing that characterizes him as a leader, there were a number of things. One, in terms of sheer oratory, you know, he did give a sober appraisal of the facts, sometimes to the point where, as home intelligence reports in Britain reported, sometimes to the point of scaring his audience to death. But then he would invariably follow with realistic grounds for optimism, not happy talk, not illusions, but realistic grounds for realistic grounds for a solution to the problem. In this case, you know, the air campaign against Britain. And then he would follow up with one of his amazing flourishes that, you know, metaphorically, but also literally in some cases, would get people rising out of their chairs saying, "Okay, I'm going out and I'm going to do battle." But yeah, it was also more than that. You touched on this, is that in that speech, he also had a way of, he was incredibly well read, had a great understanding of the grand sweep of British history, and he had a way of putting his audience into that story, as if they were soldiers on behalf of the empire and its history, and that's a very powerful thing to do.
You referenced Churchill's flaws, and there were many. One of my favorite Churchill quotes is, "When Winston is right, he is right, and when he is wrong, my God." And Churchill being the man for the moment is summarized by a quote. I love, you get the diaries that the government asked people to keep during the war, and this one really summarizes how people felt about Winston Churchill. One woman wrote, one volunteer wrote in her diary, "If I had to spend my whole life with a man, I would choose Chamberlain. But I think I would sooner have Mr. Churchill if there were a storm and I was shipwrecked."
Yes, that really kind of sums it up. Yeah, that's exactly the case. Yeah, he was again, he had his flaws, but another thing that he was very, very much aware of was the power of symbolic acts. I mean, honestly, I don't want to do speculative history, but Churchill would have been wearing a mask out in public, believe me, because he understood this power of symbolic acts, this ability to convey to people a message broader than what they're simply looking at in terms of newspaper photos and so forth. And that cuts to the I think, frankly, inane comparison of Churchill and a certain current president of the United States. This idea that first, blowing people out of a church square and then visiting and holding up a Bible has anything to do with what Churchill did on the morning after September 7, 1940, which was his first visit to the bombed-out Docklands of London, is just absolutely ludicrous, unless it turned out that the RAF bombed the Docklands so that Churchill could make a photo op, which, of course, was not the case.
Well, and of course, Churchill went there and openly wept. And people saw their prime minister weeping at the bomb damage that he was surveying. He also, one thing Churchill also did was he surrounded himself by great people. And again, I'm not, this is not about the current occupant of the presidency. I do, though, think this is a great trait for any leader, that you surround yourselves with people who get things done. And, of course, Lord Beaverbrook, quote, the Toad, the man that was loathed throughout most of Britain, Winston Churchill. And I've got to say, reading your book, the man most responsible for Great Britain surviving after Winston Churchill, at least in my opinion, of Beaverbrook, who everybody hated, he said, some take drugs, I take Max. Can you talk to people who may not be familiar with this story?
Sure. Yeah, Lord Beaverbrook.
Absolutely extraordinary job he did getting planes off the assembly line and up in the air so the RAF could defend the realm.
Yeah. He was an old, longtime friend. Their friendship waxed and waned. Longtime friend of Churchill. He was reviled by just about everybody else in Whitehall. Clementine, Churchill's wife, did not like him at all, and really would have preferred that they not know each other. But within 24 hours of becoming prime minister on May 10, 1940, Churchill, who really did have a very, very deep and realistic understanding of the ground truth of the moment. Churchill appointed Beaverbrook to a whole new ministry that Churchill had just created called the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Suddenly Beaverbrook, this reviled man, became the Minister of Aircraft Production because Churchill believed that he had just the personality. He previously was a newspaper baron. He had done an amazing job of building up the Evening Standard. And Churchill felt that this was the man who if anybody could build up Britain's fighter strength, it was going to be Beaverbrook. And it turned out to be absolutely true.
Mike Barnicle's with us and has a question. Mike.
Eric, everyone like Churchill who achieves such prominence in public office has a massive ego. We've learned that through history, and we learn it through reading everything that you've ever written. But Churchill specifically, what was it within him that, for instance, in the speech after Dunkirk, where he basically gives the bad news right up top, withdrawal is not victory, sort of tampers down the pride a bit that people felt by addressing reality. What was it about him that gave him such supreme confidence that he could do something that leaders ought to do more often, deliver bad news?
Well, a lot actually comes down to that ineffable thing called character. And he, if anything, he embodied character. But, his appraisal, how he came to burnish these skills of leadership is something that I've thought a lot about, and it's really hard to pinpoint any one thing. But he understood something very fundamental, and that is that you can't make a public believe something other than what they are experiencing. The British public understood that they were facing an existential threat. To tell them anything else would have been to create a dissonance that would really have undercut morality, and he knew that. That Dunkirk speech was a brilliant speech, and the format is something that he repeats over and over and over. It was actually a gripping retelling of Dunkirk. And with his avowal, in very matter-of-fact terms, no histrionics, that we were going to fight, on the beaches and so forth, and it was actually a brilliant speech. There was a later speech that I think is even more important, but maybe we don't need to get into that.
It is interesting that most of the world thought Britain was going to fall. Certainly, that was a message that Roosevelt was getting back from his ambassador, Kennedy. And yet, if you look at public opinion polls in Britain at the time, despite the fact that things looked so grim and dark, the overwhelming majority of British people always believed they were going to survive and prevail. I want to ask you, though, the final question, Eric. And I've got to say, somebody that's been reading on this topic for most of my life, certainly my entire adult life, the one thing I got out of your book that I haven't gotten out of any other book on the Battle of Britain was just the grimness of the raids night after night after night. It wasn't Churchill going, we think of this time period and think, well, they faced a threat. Churchill gave a speech in Parliament. Everybody said hip, hip, hooray, and they soldiered on bravely. The grimness night after night, Churchill breaking down in tears, wondering how much more bad news he could give the British people. Great Britain, the famed RAF, completely helpless to stop the German bombers coming in at night. And then finishing the book, going away with a very real belief that had Churchill not been distracted by the Russian invasion, had Goring got his wish and it continued the bombing raids on Britain. Yeah, and if Hitler had not been distracted by the coming Russian invasion and had Goring got his wish to continue bombing the British Isles, you do wonder at the end of the book how Great Britain could have survived.
Well, there is always that question. Again, that's speculative history. You also have to pay attention to what would have happened with Roosevelt. Seeing that happen, would Roosevelt have stepped up to the plate, and perhaps not waited for Pearl Harbor, which was what got America into the battle. But again, we have to come back to this ability of Churchill to build national confidence and to help people, as he put it, find their own courage. And he did that just by showing courage and absolute confidence himself. I mean, here's a man, I think probably the thing that says it all was one night there was an intense air raid, and Churchill, more often than not, would go to the rooftop to watch the raid. One night there was an intense air raid. He was having a dinner party. He decides to go up to the rooftop to watch this raid, as one does, and he brought his guests up with him and his staff to watch this raid. And as they're up there watching this intense air raid unfold, Churchill quotes Tennyson. He quotes a poem called Locksley Hall, which seems to foretell aerial warfare. I mean, here's a man with the presence of mind to be on a rooftop during a raid quoting Tennyson. And, word about that kind of thing gets out. As I talk about, he was a master at the art of, teaching the art of being fearless.
The book is The Splendid and the Vile. Erik Larson, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Great conversation.
We appreciate it so much.
Coming up, the United States hit a new record for daily coronavirus cases. Former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb is our guest next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.